Augustine lived in a modest home with his second wife, Mary Ball, and their 5 children. Young George learned reading, writing, and mathematics, occasionally venturing across the Rappahannock River to the raw little town of Fredericksburg. He did not attend college, and for the rest of his life would be conscious of what he termed his defective education. On April 12, 1743, when George was 11, his father died. The following day, less than 100 miles away, a baby named Thomas Jefferson was born. Augustine's 2 sons from his first marriage inherited most of his land. George would inherit, at age 21, Ferry Farm, 2,000 acres, 3 lots in Fredericksburg, and 10 slaves. But more important, after his father's death, George visited more often with Lawrence and the Fairfaxes. Decades later, Washington would recall time spent at Belvoir as the happiest moments of my life. The price of membership in the small club of Virginia's prestigious families was land. Mere money will melt like snow before a hot sun, Washington would later write, explaining that lands are permanent, rising fast in value. As a teenager, he studied the techniques of surveying, the necessary prelude to the acquisition and development of land, and in 1748 joined George William Fairfax and others mapping out land in the Shenandoah Valley. Acutely conscious of class distinctions, he looked down upon the poor settlers he encountered there, hating the time he had to spend with a parcel of barbarians. The following year he helped survey lots in the newly established town of Alexandria and was appointed county surveyor in Culpeper County. Paid in cash for his work, he made his first purchases of land. By the age of 18, he had already bought 1,500 acres in Virginia. And yet, not even landed wealth was sufficient for membership in the in-group. There was more. Standing over 6 feet tall, with his reddish hair, it was hard not to notice Washington. And yet it was notice, not just mere visibility, but more, that is, the regard and the esteem of others, that he craved most. Success, Washington would emphasize years later to his nephew, depended on how one appeared in the eyes of judicious men. He began the quest for notice by following in his brother Lawrence's footsteps and entering a career in the military. He traveled to Williamsburg, met with the governor, Robert Dinwiddie, and requested a post in the Virginia militia. George's connection with Colonel Fairfax proved especially helpful. Captivated by the serious, deferential, ambitious young man, Dinwiddie soon complied. Dinwiddie appointed Major Washington, the messenger who would travel into the Ohio country to give an ultimatum to French troops. In the mid-1750s, Britain and France were fighting over control of North America. Versailles had dispatched troops south of Lake Erie to seize control of the vast Ohio country northwest of Virginia. London ordered its Virginia troops to drive the French off by force of arms. It was Washington's mission to find the French position in the wilderness and present the French with a choice: withdraw from the land that Britain claimed or face Virginia troops. When the French commander rejected the ultimatum, Washington made the arduous trip home and was soon appointed lieutenant colonel in charge of a small force of fewer than 200 Virginians to confront the French enemy. Although his troops were as untrained in war as he was, he boldly sortied out, in spring 1754, to face a French force of at least 1,000 men, aided by large numbers of Indians. Making their way through the thick, trackless forest, led by Indian guides, Washington and his men came upon a small French troop and carried out a surprise attack, only to discover that one of the Frenchmen they killed was an envoy on a mission similar to Washington's earlier one, to warn the British off French land. The shots Washington's men fired marked the start of the French and Indian War. Washington and his troops proceeded to build a flimsy stockade they called Fort Necessity. In early July, after indecisive skirmishes, the arrival of fewer reinforcements than he had hoped for, and illness and deep fatigue, Washington and his soldiers were suddenly assaulted in their poorly located fort by nearly 1,000 Frenchmen. Washington was resolute in defense, but pinned within the stockade walls, hopelessly overwhelmed, he had little opportunity for generalship. Within hours he lost 1/3 of his troops, dead or wounded. Offered reasonable terms, the young colonel surrendered. Washington returned to Virginia a defeated man. Even more, a bungler who had been at times overly daring and at times indecisive, and who had been unable to enlist Indians to offset the French advantage. He might have had courage and resolution, General Lord Albemarle, the British ambassador to France, commented, but he simply had no knowledge or experience in our profession. And yet, miraculously, the 22-year-old soldier was greeted back home by fellow Virginians as something of a hero, if only for his determination and valor under fire. He allowed others to take the burden of blame for the defeat. After a year's respite from the Army, Washington missed the soldier's life and decided once again to join the military, first as a volunteer aide to General Edward Braddock, alongside whom he fought heroically, then in the fall of 1755, after much negotiation, as commander of the Virginia Regiment. To have refused the appointment, he told his mother, who disapproved of his return to military service, would have cast eternal dishonor upon him. War between England and France was officially declared in 1756, after which most of the battles would take place farther north. In 1758, Washington's final mission, to seize Fort Duquesne from the French, would end successfully without a shot. The French had retreated, leaving their fort in flames. If the whole episode of Washington's 5-year military career told something of his limitations, it blazoned forth a crucial aspect of the young colonel in his early 20s, his ever-present ambition. During his years in the military, Washington had been engaged in 2 parallel campaigns. One was for military victory, the other was for notice. The chief part of my happiness, he candidly admitted, was the esteem and notice of his country. People could hardly ignore the striking uniforms he had designed and ordered for himself and his troops, blue coats with scarlet and silver cuffs, red waistbands, and hats embellished with silver trim. But the notice he sought required more than cultivated appearance. To win the respect of his social and professional superiors, he would also have to cultivate his own reputation and honor. He longed for evidence that society's leaders held him in higher esteem than the common run of provincial officers. Even the official statement of gratitude that he and his troops received from the House of Burgesses in 1754 was not sufficient. So began his quest for a royal commission in the regular British Army, a long journey on horseback to Boston to meet with the acting commander-in-chief of British forces in America. No royal commission was forthcoming. A year later, he went off again on the same errand, now to Philadelphia, again in vain. Neither Washington's military campaigns nor his campaign for rank had ended in dazzling success. And yet, by 1758, he was no longer simply a beginner, as he had written earlier to his brother. He had served as a military leader, been warmly praised by his officers, feted by prominent families in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. But still, no royal commission. Wouldn't it be less frustrating to return to Mount Vernon, which he had been renting from Lawrence's widow since his death in 1752, marry well, begin his own family, and join the landed gentry and governing class of Virginia? Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy young widow, struck Washington as an agreeable consort. Love is too dainty a food to live on alone, he would counsel his step-granddaughter years later. The marital partner, he explained to her, should possess good sense, a good disposition, a good reputation, and financial means. To their marriage, Martha brought 6,000 acres, 100 slaves, and her 2 children. For their wedding, Washington ordered his clothes from London. Would Washington have ever been commander of the Revolutionary Army or President of the United States if he had not married the rich widow of Mr. Custis? Asked John Adams, whose own wife was so crucial to his career and happiness. It was 1759. He was 27, had just resigned from the military, in which he would not serve again for 16 years, and had, a few months earlier, won a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses. At the first session he attended as a young legislator, the Burgesses expressed their official gratitude for his faithful services to His Majesty and this colony, and for his brave and steady behavior. Washington rose and bowed, blushing with pleasure. In the House of Burgesses he mostly listened, intent on absorbing the new protocol of politics. During the 10 weeks a year when the Burgesses were in session, George and Martha enjoyed the social life in Williamsburg, attending dinner parties and balls. Back home at Mount Vernon, which he inherited in 1761, he worked at making himself indispensable to the community, serving as a vestryman in Truro Parish, trustee of the town of Alexandria, and justice of the county court. With an acute sense of responsibility to others, combined with a desire to win their respect, he devoted much of his time to writing letters, settling accounts, acting as executor for the estates of his friends and acquaintances. His happiest moments were spent at Mount Vernon. His dream was to transform it into a grand English-style manor house and plantation, and indeed it soon became a self-sufficient and profitable agricultural and industrial village. In addition to fields of tobacco, wheat, and corn, there was also a dairy, a smokehouse, a cider press, a vineyard, fruit orchards, a flour mill, a sawmill, and a cloth factory. Washington managed and supervised every aspect of his estate, from fishing on the Potomac to the breeding and selling of horses. Indentured white workers toiled along with black slaves. By the mid-1770s, he owned nearly 200 slaves, coolly exchanging some of them for rum, molasses, and limes. He provided his slaves with little, scant clothing, few blankets, perfunctory medical care. When runaways were caught, they were flogged. But some got away. "God knows I have losses enough in Negroes," he complained. Significantly, the most glaring difference that Washington perceived between blacks and himself, their lack of interest in their reputations, reveals what was most essential and precious to him. "Blacks are capable of much labor," he wrote, "but having no ambition to establish a good name, they are too regardless of a bad one." In his other business dealings, he watched vigilantly over his profits and did not hesitate to lash out at anyone trying to take advantage of him. "All my concern is that I ever engaged myself in behalf of so ungrateful and dirty a fellow as you are," he snapped at one associate. In his manor house, he was served by 13 house slaves. Clothing, furniture, paintings, dishes, wines, and spices were shipped periodically from London. Busts of famous soldiers, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and others, were ordered, but statues of Bacchus and Flora arrived instead. From England also came a fashionable carriage, adorned with gilded molding and Washington's own crest. He and Martha led an active social life. They entertained often at Mount Vernon, and hospitably welcomed their guests. Fashionable clothing, military busts, and elegant carriages mattered to Washington, but the game was still about land, for investment as well as for prestige. Governor Dinwiddie had promised 200,000 acres at the confluence of the Ohio and the Kanawha to the soldiers who fought in the Army of 1754, and when the land was finally distributed, years later, Washington secured for himself 20,000 of the best acreage. Some of the other veterans would protest that he had grabbed the choicest parcels for himself and even swindled them out of their own lots. Washington looked toward western Pennsylvania, too, for land, and also sent an agent to scout for land in West Florida. The greatest fortunes and the greatest estates, he noted, were made by purchasing at very low rates the rich backlands that eventually became the most valuable properties. Still, it was not all about acquisition, for some of his schemes were visionary. The company he formed to purchase and drain the land called the Dismal Swamp south of the Chesapeake, and his plan for a Potomac Canal for shipping and commerce, a waterway that, in his mind's eye, would eventually connect the Western Territory with the Atlantic states. Navigable inland waterways, he would write after the Revolutionary War, would transport the produce of the Western settlers to the Atlantic and increase American exports, while binding those settlers to us by a chain which never can be broken. A mind like his, an impressed James Madison would write to Jefferson in 1785 about Washington's extensive plans for inland water transportation, was capable of great views. In politics, he was more aggressive about holding on to his seat and shutting out any opponents than he was attentive to the duties of a Burgess. Some years he attended no sessions at all. When he wasn't skipping meetings, it was local issues that concerned him most. One bill he sponsored was meant to protect the purity of local wells by controlling the raising of hogs. But the political landscape was about to shift dramatically. In 1765, Parliament passed the